Guys, it's me again. I wanted to do a chapel story for you. I'm going to do a chapel story about the Passover. Then I'm going to lead you up to the story of Easter. And then we're going to do some fun resurrection eggs. And I'm going to give your parents a couple of videos to go along with it so you can watch videos as well. But today we're going to do the Passover. Now, Passover and Easter come around the same time, and there's a reason for that. Okay, so Jesus was a Jew. He was from the country of Israel, but this was way before Jesus was born. Okay, there was a little boy named Moses, and we talked about Moses a long time ago, the first of the year. And remember when we made the little, remember there was a mean king called the Pharaoh, and he said, those Israelites, they have been taken as slaves by the Pharaoh. He lived in the country of Egypt, so he took all the Israelites to Egypt. And he said, you're going to work for me and you're going to be my slaves, and you can't go away back to your country. And so they worked for him for, a long time. Well, the people of Israel were they were having a lot of babies, and he was like, oh dear, this is not good. We've got more slaves than we do people that I'm ruling over. And he said, I don't want that to happen, because if there's too many of them, then they could overthrow my government and they could be the king. And that is not going to happen. So he made that rule. Remember the rule where all the baby boys 2 years of age and under, like those kids from Miss Linda's class and younger, they had to be killed. Okay? And the soldiers were coming door to door, knocking on the door and taking the babies away from their mommies and killing them. But God, always remember that phrase. So God put it in the heart of this woman who had a little boy who was just a baby, and his name was Moses, and her name was Jochebed. And I hope I'm saying that right. Well, she said, you are not going to take my baby and kill him. I'm going to hide him. So she kept saying, God, what can I do? God, what can I do? And so God said, go and make a little basket and line it with tar, because tar, if the rain comes on tar, it just goes off. It's water resistant, kind of like your raincoats. And so line it with that and put a lid on it, put a cloth in there, a little blanket for him, and go put him in the river. And you were like, the river, no, float down. But no, he put him in the river. She put him in the river in the reeds where the tall weeds are growing, and she put him in the middle of it and told his older sister Miriam to go watch it so it didn't ever float away. So she was hiding and she was watching. And remember the story? One day the princess of the Pharaoh, the daughter of the Pharaoh, the princess came, and she was like, there's something in the water, maid. Go get that for me. And it ended up to be she got Moses' basket. And when she opened it up, she fell in love with him. She didn't have any babies. She always wanted babies. And she said, I'm going to keep this baby. And so Miriam came up out of the bushes and she said, Princess, would you like for someone to take care of him for you? And she said, that would be great. Because, back then and sometimes even now, rich people don't take care of their own kids. So they hire somebody to do it. So they hired Moses' mommy, and he took care of him. And then when he got old enough, he got to live in the palace. But then when he got old enough, he saw some of the way that the Pharaoh and his people were treating the people of Israel, who were building things and doing everything that he told them to do. And even if they minded him, he would beat them and hurt them really bad. And Moses was mad. So one day he saw one of the Egyptians hurting an Israelite person that was just trying to do his job, and he was beating him. And Moses came and he killed the Egyptian. Well, then the Pharaoh got really mad. Now, the Pharaoh was his grandpa, and he got really mad at him. And so Moses had to run. So Moses left that country, and he went out and he found his people, the people of Israel, some people. And he said, well, no, they weren't Israel. That he went away from the country of Egypt, and he went into the desert and found some people there. He got married, he had kids, blah, blah, blah. And he was a grown man. But the Lord said, Moses, you're going to go back to that Pharaoh. And he said, no, I can't go back. He's going to kill me. And he said, no, you're going back and you're going to deliver the people. They have been praying for years and years and years for me to send somebody, and you're the man. So Moses was like, oh dear. So he said, okay, I'll do it. But he went to the king, the Pharaoh, and he said, you have been mean to these people. These are the people of God. They want to go back to their own country so they can worship God. And you know what the Pharaoh said? No, I'm not going to let them go. They build all my buildings. They do all my work. I'm not going to let them go. And he said, well, the Lord told me to tell you that I'm going to turn your rivers into blood. So, just like that, the rivers all turned to blood. And they stayed that way for like 7 days. And the people, they couldn't drink from it because it wasn't water, it was the blood. And they couldn't bathe in it because it was blood. So they were all dirty, they were all thirsty, and it stunk. I don't know if you know how blood smells, but when you have a whole bunch of blood, it stinks. And guess what happened to the animals in the ocean or in the rivers? They died. The fish all died because they needed water too. So then he went back after 7 days and he said, are you going to let my people go? And he said, nope, I'm really mad now. And so he said, well, God's going to send frogs. So all of a sudden, bam, overnight, there were frogs everywhere. Frogs in their bed, frogs in their food, frogs everywhere. Frogs, 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 except for there were no frogs in the Israelite camp. They were the slaves, and God protected them. So after a few days of this, he goes back and he says, you let them go now? And he said, no, I'm madder than ever. And he said, well, all right, God's going to send plague number 3. Remember, plague number 1 was the river turned into blood. They couldn't drink the water, couldn't take a bath. The fish all died. Plague number 2 was the frogs. Plague number 3, gnats. There were gnats everywhere, and they were like biting gnats too. And so there were kind of like mosquitoes everywhere, but gnats. And they hated it. And he let that go for a few days. And then Moses came in and said, well, are you going to let my people go? And he said, no, never. Okay, so he said, that's fine then. God says he's going to bring a wind to blow in flies. So just like that, bzzz, everywhere. And flies are nasty, and they bring germs, okay? So flies were all in their food. Flies were everywhere. Flies were biting them. Flies were everywhere. But guess where they were not? They were not in the slaves' camp. They didn't even touch the slaves. So they just touched the Egyptians. And a few days of that, and then he goes back to Pharaoh, and he says, will you let my people go now? Because if you don't, God's going to bring something worse. And he said, no! And so God said, fine, I'll just crank it up a notch. So he said, they have all these livestock, cattle and horses and everything. That's how they feed their people. That's how they get around. And he said, I'm going to kill them all. So he killed all of the animals that the Egyptians owned, even their dogs. But guess whose animals he didn't kill? The Israelites. They still had work animals and everything. So he goes back a few days later and he says, listen, Pharaoh, you've got to start listening to God. And you know what? The Bible says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. That means he was not going to listen. So he said, no, I'm not going to let him go. So he said, well, okay, that's fine. Then God says pestilence will come. So the next day, they had sores all over their bodies. The men, the women, the children. The animals got big old sores called boils. In the Bible terms, it as pestilence. That's what pestilence is. It's like diseases and stuff. They came all over their bodies, and they would like ooze out and really gross. And they'd scratch and itch, and they just were miserable. They couldn't lay down in the bed because the boils were all over them. And so he goes back to Pharaoh, and he says, look what this is doing to your people. And Pharaoh even had him. And he said, I don't care. I'm not letting you go. So he said, well, all right. God's destroyed all your animals. You still have crops. You've got corn and potatoes and onions and tomatoes. So God said he's going to send hail. So the next day, big old balls of hail, which is ice that falls from the sky. Moses had said, you better get your people inside because it's going to be really big and it might hurt them. They didn't listen to him. So the next day when the hail came, some people died because they got showered with big ice balls that were beating them to death. And their crops died. Some of the animals died. So then, a few days later, it didn't hurt the Israelites, by the way. So he goes back and he says, Pharaoh, please let my people go, because if you don't, your people are going to, look, your animals are destroyed, your crops, are destroyed for the most part. Your people, oh my gosh, please, for everybody's sake, let these people go. And he said, no, I'm not going to. So then the next day, God blew in another wind, and it was big old locust. Now, I don't know if you know what a locust looks like. I was going to Google that for you and show you a picture, but they're big old flying insects, and they eat everything. So like whatever corn or onions or potatoes or tomatoes were left from the hail that didn't get killed, the locust came and got them. and they ate the trees. They were everywhere. So then a few days of that, Moses goes back and he says, Pharaoh, please, please, I'm begging you, let the people go. And he said, I'm not going to. And just like that, everything turned dark. And it was in the middle of the day. So where he was with Pharaoh, everything was dark, and it stayed dark for a while. But guess who didn't have dark? Guess who had sunshine? The Israelites. The sun was shining on their place where they lived, but everywhere in Egypt it was dark. Okay? So after a few days of that, he goes back and he said, listen, you've had your river turn to blood, your frogs, your gnats, your flies, your livestock all die, your animals, boils and diseases on the people. You've had hail. You've had locusts. Bleh. You've had darkness. This is going to be the worst plague of all. God said this time, if you don't let my people go and go back to the country of Israel and quit making them work for you and be the slaves, then I'm going to send my angel of death, and he is going to kill your firstborn. That means the oldest child of every family, boy, girl, whatever, whether they were 1 or whether they were 10, God said, I'm gonna kill them. And not only your kids, but if there's any animals left, which most of them were dead, but I'm gonna kill the firstborn of them too. Okay? So then he goes back to the camp of Israel and he says, listen, God told me to tell you, get your clothes on tonight, get your shoes on tonight, grab some belongings, eat on the run. He wants you to take a spotless boy lamb. He wants you to kill it, and he wants you to roast its meat in the fire and eat, because you're going to need some protein, okay? And then he said, I want you to take the blood of that lamb, and don't let it go to waste. I want you to take that blood, and I want you to put it on the door of your houses. Put it here, all the way up. Put it across and spread it all the way down on the lintel and the doorpost. And he said, because when you do that, tonight, when the death angel comes, if he does not see the blood on that doorpost, then your kids are going to die too. So he said, please. So all the Israeli people, all the Jewish slaves, they took the lamb. They got their clothes on. They got their shoes on. They got their bags packed. They were ready to roll. And so he said, they took a lamb. They killed it. They put its blood on the doorpost. They roasted that meat. They ate a good meal. And then God said, when you do this, wait. Then the next morning came, and you could hear the screams and the cries of the people of Egypt, because their babies, their firstborn child had died. Even Pharaoh's firstborn child died. And he wasn't so much mad now as he was sad. He didn't know what else to do. So then God said, go ask him again, Moses. So Moses went back and he said, Pharaoh, I'm so sorry, but you didn't listen to God. You didn't listen to him the first time, the second time, the third time, the fourth time, the fifth time, the sixth time, the seventh time, the eighth time, or the ninth time. And then the 10th came, and now your son is dead. Will you please, please let my people go? And he said, get out of here. So right then, Moses goes back and he takes all those 2 million people that were slaves, and they leave the country of Egypt to go back to their homeland. God had delivered them by using that little baby boy, Moses. Now remember this story, because when we are doing the story of the Easter story, you're going to need to remember this. But until then, see you later. Bye.